people who had one-night stands on September 10 of 2001. What was the next morning like?
I didn't find out until the afternoon.
Not me, but an old friend. He was spending the night with an FWB of his in Jersey City. He lived in Brooklyn at the time. Long story short, they literally wound up watching everything happen from the roof of her building.
I used to work with a guy who this actually happened to. He was in DC, so the Pentagon bombings were more what he was dealing with. It was apparently an older woman, and she immediately called her friend over to commiserate and had put his clothes into wash, so he was trapped in the house with two crying women in front of the TV wearing nothing but a woman's robe. Reading this from a foreign perspective is really interesting. First time I saw Fight Club was Sept 10. The next day really freaked me out after that.
Most people don't remember this, but the week prior to September 11, 2001 was a week of heavy storms, and there were 1 to 2 building and roof collapses in NYC in the prior week and month. One in the Lower East Side, one in Brooklyn, I think. So the night prior, with all that heavy rain, and waking up the morning to news that something collapsed really didn't seem surprising, except that what collapsed was unexpected.
I woke up first, saw the news, and had to go back into the bedroom to wake her up and tell her what was happening. That moment felt very intense. I had the feeling I had a dire responsibility to choose my words very carefully. We spent the next few days together. Then we dated for a couple of years and got married. We're still married and have a little family. I joke with her about how 9/11 is kind of our anniversary sometimes. She doesn't think it's particularly funny. But we've both wondered aloud how much of an influence that experience of the attacks had on the seriousness of our relationship.
Fun fact, both my parents were in the military at the time. If it wasn't for 9/11, then they would have never been stationed at the same military base, never have met, and I would have never been born.
I just want to say this is one of the most interesting questions I've ever seen on askreddit.
Not a one-night stand, but still probably worth telling. For context, I was born in New York City but lived in the Midwest at the time. My girlfriend and I occasionally would sneak off to a second house her family owned. They didn't have a TV or radio or even a clock there. So when we woke up, nothing was any different for us other than a lack of traffic. We stopped in at a comic book store and saw the reports about the stolen planes on the news. That's scary, but probably nothing will come of it. A little bit of conversation later and we realized that this is our day off, and turning on the radio is potentially a horrible idea, since we're still in denial enough that we're positive this is nothing. It becomes odd that every third gas station has jumped their prices up to $5 a gallon. But people get greedy at times. Right. We go to get a late breakfast at a place she's taken me to quite a bit. Normally this place has sports on TVs spread out in every corner. But today everyone is set to a different news station. A few minutes after ordering, we see playback of the first plane hitting. The TVs don't have subtitles on, so we can't hear what's happening. A couple of minutes later she asks me, "Hey, did that look right to you?" I thought the plane hit lower down, so we look around at all the news stations and realize that wasn't just one plane, it was two. I don't think either of us did much other than push our food around the plates. After this we try to go back to mindless shopping, but it's no use. There's a TV everywhere and people are talking about it. Nearly every gas station has raised their prices, and some have closed outright. My girlfriend remembers hearing from her brother that I was born somewhere near Baltimore because of a trip we took there once, and asks me about it. When I tell her, she erupts into tears, apologizing to me. I tell her everything is alright and we go see a movie, because we're determined to not let anything change despite the fact that everything has. A silly waifu re-envisioning of the Three Musketeers has never been better than when it was shielding you from the most terrifying thing you've ever seen. A little bit later I drop her off at her car and go home. and get screamed at by my entire family because they had no idea where I was. Despite living at least 10 hours away from New York, the phrase, "you went to a movie," was said in some form constantly for the next week.
9/11 was on a Tuesday. Your life must be some kind of interesting if you are having a one-night stand on a Monday night.
I heard a rumor which may true, that this guy who worked in the WTC decided to hook up with his mistress instead of going into the office on 9/11. He had turned off his phone during the tryst, and when he turned it back on, his wife had blown up his phone. With a bazillion texts and messages. So, he calls her back, and his wife, frantic with worry and panic, answers, "OMG, where are you?" Quote. He says, "I'm at work." Why? Quote.
There was a girl on a lot of missing posters back then. She went missing on September 11th but didn't have any reason to be at the towers. Around 2011, they finally learned that she had a one-night stand with a guy who worked in the towers and brought him lunch the next day. Terrible timing. She was from a conservative Indian family, so hadn't told them where she was. I actually lost my virginity on Sept 10, 2001. I was a junior in high school and woke up the next morning excited to tell my buddies about my night. I didn't know about the attacks until I got to school and our teacher was listening to the news. Obviously my news took a back seat to the attacks, until lunchtime. A few of us were at the lunch table talking about the attacks, and during a pause in the conversation, I mentioned that my girlfriend and I had gone all the way last night. Thinking I would maybe get a nice or well done sir type comment, my buddies just started blaming me and my actions for killing thousands of people.
Fucking weird. I woke up to a phone call from my mom, who didn't know where I was, saying, "We've been bombed." I was a teen at the time and thought we were all just going to die. The weirdest part of that day was how everything turned into a ghost town. Driving home, no cars, everything was closed. It felt like everyone died and I had missed it. I've never felt that same fear since that day. I got laid because of the 9/11 attacks. Quite literally, I would not have met this woman if not for the attacks. She knocked on my door asking to watch the news because she was from NY and didn't have a TV of her own. We had lunch, smoked some pot and watched NY burn. We spent the whole day together. Not that awkward. It was awful, and the awfulness was very humanizing. We watched TV and had coffee. Nobody went to work. We were in NYC. We met up later that week. Stayed friends for a while. I just remember how sad it was. Interesting story. When it happened, I was in class taught by what I remember was the former director of USAID for South America. He was teaching a class on how global wealth inequality would lead to religious extremism and was talking about the rise of terrorism from both Christians and Muslims organizations. My friend called me in the middle of class. I had a pretty sweet flip phone made by some Scandinavian company. I got a stern looking at for having my phone ring in class, because she kept calling. Finally I answered and she said we were attacked and we were at war and they think they are going to attack Pittsburgh. This was a worry at the time. I forget why. And we saw tons of people outside the doors in the hallways, and that was that. I don't remember that night in September. Kid graduates high school this year.